see you.
Very pleased to see you again. Without masks this time.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so let's start with the masks. This session is technology in times of post-COVID. Is that a misnomer? Are we in times of post-COVID, or are you, like we are at The Economist, a little wary about the possibility of another wave on the way?
It's like quantum physics. We both are and aren't.
Right.
We have a double state. And in a sense, there are certain elements which I guess we have surpassed vis-a-vis the COVID period and the nucleus of the COVID period, and there are certain elements that remain. And I think that this is something that more or less we expected. If you read literature about any pandemic in the history of the world, not only on the digital sphere, but overall vis-a-vis what happened in any pandemic, there's a phenomenal book called Epidemics and Society, which captures that, by Frank Snowden, I think. You can see that after any pandemic, after 2 or 3 years, effectively, certain things as social norms remained, or as policies. And Yuval Harari wrote a very interesting essay on the FT. I think it was, actually it was the weekend of the first lockdown, March 2020. And the title of the essay was After the Pandemic, even though the pandemic was just beginning. And the whole idea was that the pandemic would be over after a couple of years, effectively. But what would remain would be your policy choices, especially on the digital front. So be very careful with regards to what choices you will be making. And careful, I think we were. We decided as a government to follow an acute strategy of empowerment. We had already designed a strategy, our Prime Minister and his team in Greece, to empower citizens by digitizing public services, simplify public services, offer gov.gr as the key premise of our digital policy, and we decided to continue upon that policy by rendering it also a policy to battle the virus, because as we were eliminating interactions, we were effectively limiting the reasons to meet other people physically. And the numbers show that this was successful. We started from 8.8 million digital transactions in 2018, and we had 567 million digital transactions in 2021. This is more or less, I would say, 63 physical visits per adult Greek avoided because of this policy. So I guess it's a success.
Yeah, that does sound like a success. I want to invite you to reflect a little bit on a counterfactual. So there's been a lot of, we've talked about this more than once, the impact that COVID had as an accelerant on the uptake of the development of digital services and the uptake of digital services. I'd like you just to sort of go through a counterfactual. Where would we be now had we not been confronted by COVID? What would Greek policy have been? What would your job have been? And where would you be relative to where we are now if COVID had never happened?
My claim would be that it would be quite similar. And in effect, in order to make this case, I would ask you, even though it's in Greek, to see what we said mid-2019 after we were elected in Parliament. Effectively, we described the same projects. We described gov.gr, we described the 5G auction, which was mentioned just before. We described a series of projects which we said would happen by specific timeframes, and the deadlines were met. What happened was, I would say, work on top of this. We wouldn't, for instance, have vaccinated the whole population through a very sophisticated digital system, which acted, I think, as a signal over and above vaccination that the state's processes and overall state services shall change because of what we're trying to do. We wouldn't have created the full spectrum of digital projects which were COVID specific. What happened through those projects is that in effect they acted as mechanisms for onboarding, even for people who were not digitally very savvy, who had other people who would help them, members of their family or their accountants in many cases. People onboarded certain COVID specific projects, and this sort of created a hype for digital policy which increased demand. If we divide overall the digital policy of this government in demand and supply, I would say that the supply would have remained the same with the exception of the COVID-specific measures. Question mark vis-a-vis demand, because COVID accelerated certain demand parameters.
Right, indeed, and that is hard. It's hard to sort of calculate with any sense of accuracy how things might have changed without that demand. What comes next then for you? I mean, you have done everything that's on record in response to COVID as it unfolded. What are the coming challenges? So what's left on your agenda? I mean, that's not to suggest you'll ever finish it, because I'm sure you won't. But what are the big challenges that you see directly in front of you?
Actually, short comment with regards to what you just said. We actually can calculate the spectrum, I would say, or the magnitude of COVID-specific services within the transactions that I mentioned. So out of the 567 million transactions, around 20% were COVID-specific. So I guess that this sort of gives a sense of the magnitude of the work compared to the other elements. With regards to what's next, I think that we're only at the end of the beginning, to use a very famous quote. Why? Because Greece had a very big problem to solve originally. We had one of the most bureaucratic countries, certainly in the OECD. There are many studies which manifest this. There were studies even before the Greek financial crisis which showed that we were first amongst OECD members with regards to the cost of administrative burdens in our economy, in our GDP. What happened during the financial crisis was that the Greek GDP contracted, so one could make the case that this sort of remained so. We're now recalculating the exact cost of administrative burdens. So what happened is that we have started solving for this. Have we fully solved for this? No. We have digitized and simplified a full scope of services. We have 1,400 plus services in the portal. We started by 501 services. What's next is that we need to find what the denominator is. This is the numerator. No country knows the denominator. Countries generally don't know. A bank knows how many services it offers or how many processes it has. A state typically doesn't. So what we're trying to do is that this Friday, we're launching a project called Mythos. It comes from ancient Greek mythology and the Minotaur and Ariadne's help of Theseus. So overall, the whole concept of Mythos is that we wanted to calculate the exact scope of processes in any life event of a citizen or of a corporation to have a sense of what's already digital or not. And then once you can measure, you can systematically simplify. Now we're simplifying, but we're doing it, I have to say, in an ad hoc manner. We know what we want to simplify Pareto-wise. We know what things we typically do when interacting with the state. You renew your driver's license, your child goes to kindergarten, you enter a hospital, etc., etc. But we need to find the more, I would say, granular things and try to simplify them using technology. And this is what this project will allow us to do. In my view, it's one of the core projects for this year. Obviously, we also need to procure the full scope of the RRF projects. Greece has a Marshall Plan in our hands for this decade, which is the RRF, the post-COVID reconstruction funds of the EU. This comes on top of the traditional European structural funds. I would say that those funds are extremely important for us on the digital policy front to implement a strategy which would have otherwise been extremely difficult to implement. Back in 2019, we were calculating and mapping the projects that we wanted when speaking with the other ministries, and we found out that we simply didn't have the budget to implement 100% of the policy, and we needed to make very, very difficult choices between, I would say, facets of necessity. Now we have the budget to implement what we really want, what's necessary, and on top of it, what we should be doing in order to transition to a new era, to a new period, what we call the fourth industrial revolution, rather than solely the outstanding issues of the past. So procurement for these projects is a huge task on its own. We have never procured at that scale. So we have a separate team, a separate organization called Information Society, which is doing so. They're writing the RFPs of the projects and they're procuring at the same time. Obviously, there are many other things on the telecom front. There are many other things on the policy front. Just to quote two extra things that we will be doing in the next couple of weeks. The first one is that we're presenting a bill in Parliament on emerging technologies, which is not something that Greece has typically done. Typically on regulation, especially on the technology front, we act as quote-unquote price takers. Typically it's Brussels that regulates and you have a seat at the table. What we're attempting to do so through this bill is that for certain technologies like AI, drones, blockchain, smart contracts, etc., we want to propose certain regulatory approaches of our own on top of what's expected to happen through the EU path. I think that this shows ideas leadership, and we have people on the ground who know how to do this. So this bill hopefully will be voted by the Greek Parliament by the end of July. And on top of this, I think we have a very interesting symbolic move which we're doing. We said that we would transition to digital IDs at the beginning of our tenure. and we're doing so. Hopefully on July 27th, depending on the schedule of the Prime Minister, we will be launching driver's licenses and IDs on a separate application on a wallet app on your phone. And I think that this is very interesting. It will have use cases, obviously. You will be able to circulate within Greece to begin with using only your mobile phone. You won't have to carry your ID anymore. But I think that it's very interesting to have such a symbolism within the digital policy project as well, because it symbolizes the end of an era and the beginning of a new one.
Fascinating, yeah. The new technologies law that you mentioned, what's the spirit of it? So you want to go beyond what Brussels is mandating to achieve something different for Greece. What is that difference? What's the spirit of what you're trying to put through?
Well, if I were to make an analogy from the digital field, I would say that traditionally, I mean, if you think of Greece, not only on digital, but on any field, more or less, you would say that even in the past years, before our government came in, the country had the hardware but lacked the software. So you have phenomenal location, phenomenal people, but the policies, the software, were not there to unleash the growth potential to the extent that it could. The Mitsotakis administration is effectively trying to do that thing. We're trying on every policy field to create the scope of laws, policies, regulations, and specific projects which will unleash this potential. And through our digital policy overall, we're trying to unleash the potential of phenomenal engineers. Effectively, this is what we're trying to do here. It's a signal of ideas leadership, but I think it's also practical and on the ground. And practically speaking, to give you one example, any big company in Greece that will be using AI to make labor decisions shall say so. They will need to say so publicly. We're delighted that this is happening, but it should be public. Everybody should know what algorithms are being used. We need to have algorithmic transparency, etc. I think that this showcases, again, a philosophy of empowerment. We want to move forward, but we want to project our values on the technology. And the idea is that values are projected both on the books of law and on the screens of code. And I think that this is something which overall distinguishes the European Union. This is what we're trying to do through regulation. The EU is a regulatory superpower. We're trying to project values on technological development. And I think that member states like Greece should attempt to do so given their set of strengths and weaknesses. We have lots of strengths on the digital and engineering fields, and we want to unleash them.
Fascinating, thank you. You mentioned, well, you didn't. Other people in the previous panel mentioned talent, the importance of people. You mentioned freeing engineers, as it were, empowering engineers. This may be beyond your brief, in which case I apologize. Ensuring how to bring around the transformation that you have in mind.
Well, overall, we need I guess it's a full scope of things. A part of it is that talent that left Greece. Again, to quote a very famous author, a very famous journalist, Thomas Friedman, I remember quite vividly an article written by Thomas Friedman at the beginning of the Greek financial crisis on the New York Times. And it was the moment when Greece had signed its first IMF bailout. And Tom Friedman said at the end of the article that I'm not the bond spreads in the coming years. I'm going to be watching one thing, one single variable, the young Greeks. If you see them fleeing the country, start selling Greek bonds. If you see them staying or some of them coming back, it's the time to start buying. And they're coming back. They're coming back right now. The RRF, the overall policies that this government is promoting are enabling this, especially on the technology fields, but it's obvious on the ground that lots of people who previously lived in London or who previously lived in the US start seeing opportunities in Greece, and this is why the unemployment rate is declining. So a part of it is to bring talent, which is the low-hanging fruit, let's say. The second element of the answer to your question, I think, is how to generate even more talent at scale and at scope. And overall, the education systems around the world are changing, right? In the generation of my parents, it was a narrative of a sole degree. In my generation, it was the narrative of the master's degree. In the generation of my children, or even I would say older children than my children, it shall be continuous education. You will have some generic skills to begin with, and as technology is accelerating and as life expectancy is increasing, you will typically have more than one career, and you will continuously need to reskill yourself and enter and leave the job market continuously. Especially on the IT fields, we need to rethink reskilling. and we're attempting to do so. There are many interesting endeavors and many interesting, I would say, projects throughout the European Union which we're trying to learn from. My favorite, I would say, is Area 42, which is a very interesting French example. It's a school in Paris which doesn't offer a formal degree, but once you're selected by that school, it's very, very easy to find a job in engineering, and you're typically extremely good at coding. Those types of projects, I think, are projects that we need to learn from in order to be able to reskill especially STEM graduates on programming and on IT.
Great answer. Thank you so much. I mean, I can only suggest that some of the tide of Greeks returning from London is less about the attractions of Greece and more about current events in London.
I was trying to be kind.
Yeah. All right. Well, please join me in thanking the Minister. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. It's always a pleasure.